and Jeff and Fred. So I'm going to age myself here, but growing up, one of my favorite TV programs was Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, hosted by the dapper and soft-spoken Marlin Perkins. And if you've ever watched a program, a more recent program on something like Animal Planet or anything about sharks or elephants or conservation, I think we have Wild Kingdom to thank for that kind of programming. It was the granddaddy of all those shows, inspiring generations with a fascination for wildlife. So on the show, Marlin was usually seated in a very comfortable studio, calmly introducing that week's adventure and casually reminding viewers about the importance of term life insurance. And he would cut to his co-host and sidekick, Jim Fowler. And Jim was the one who was actually out in the wild doing all the real work, wrestling alligators or climbing trees with orangutans, or getting way too close to a group of hungry lions in the Serengeti. Jim was sort of a khaki-clad Tarzan who had dropped by REI on his way out to a near-death experience. And I will never forget one episode. Jim was out on foot in the tall golden grass of Tanzania, and he says, look, there are some lions. Gosh, they look like they haven't eaten in days. And the camera zooms in on a pride of lions who appeared to be disturbingly alert to Jim's presence and begin moving toward him. And then you cut back to Marlin. Well, Jim, we'll take a break now. Let's talk about life insurance. Now that I know a little bit more about television production, I'm guessing Jim might not have been quite as much in danger as the editing suggested. But I still really admired Jim. He exuded something that I envied, not just a rugged sense of adventure, but deep calm under extreme pressure. He never seemed afraid. Nothing ever rattled that guy. He just moved forward, clearly aware and alert to the danger, but undeterred all the same. So what I saw in Jim Fowler was something I wanted for myself and still do. Not recklessness, but confidence. Not a denial of danger, but freedom from fear. And I think that longing to move through life without being burdened by worry, I think that's one that we all share. A few years ago, I read a great book called Living Presence by an author named Kabir Helminski. He's a Sufi, and so he writes from that tradition. And in the book, he suggests that our entire spiritual journey from birth to death can be described as the progressive overcoming of fear. He writes that fear, often unspoken, often unconscious, is the great obstacle between us and a life of fullness and joy, the kind of life that we're really created to live. And you may or may not agree with that premise, but I think there's a lot of truth to it. Because Jesus himself said again and again, do not be afraid. Now, why would he repeat that unless fear was such a persistent human problem? 13th century Sufi Persian poet named Rumi said something very similar, that so much of what we experience as emotional agony is really fear in disguise, and that fear, whether it's about the future, or it's about health, our relationships, or a sense of security, fear can wear down our happiness. It can rob us of our peace. And I think that's the real tragedy, because joy really is not something we should see as a luxury. Joy is the default setting of our souls, I believe. It's the atmosphere in which we absolutely function best when we're grounded in joy, what the Apostle Paul calls peace that surpasses understanding. We're better at everything that we do: decision-making, empathy, creativity, building community. But when worry takes over, it's like hitting an iceberg on the voyage of life. It doesn't just slow us down, it can sink us. So how do we avoid all those icebergs out there? Well, I think we start by learning how to see them for what they are. When Paul wrote his letter to the Philippians, he famously said, "Rejoice in the Lord always." Again, I will say rejoice. Don't worry about a thing. Now, I've always thought that sounded like someone who's writing from a peaceful beach resort, on a hammock between palm trees, nursing a drink with a little umbrella in it. But the reality was quite different. Paul was in prison when he wrote that letter, a first century Roman jail. No one's idea of a resort. I think we can imagine what that was like. Perhaps even awaiting trial or execution. That is so important to remember when we read this letter to the Philippians. Paul was not spouting motivational cliches from a position of comfort. His very life was hanging by a thread, and yet he's telling his friends not to worry, keep on rejoicing. So what does that tell us? I think Paul's affirming that true joy is not dependent on external circumstances. The state of joy, joyful way of being, is rooted somewhere deeper and internal, somewhere spiritual. So how do we cultivate that kind of joy, especially when life can often be far from joyful? How do we live without letting fear dictate our every move? Well, I wish I had an easy answer, but I really don't. I don't even think that the answer is about having a strong faith, whatever that might mean. Faith, in my experience, is not about certainty. It's not about having life all figured out. In fact, the people I trust most in a spiritual sense are the ones who admit how much they do not know. The ones who will say, I'm just a work in progress. People who live in the mystery, but stay curious. So if faith is not the equivalent of certainty, maybe it's more like awareness, a kind of alertness to how we're thinking and feeling, the ability to pause and to reflect and to ask, well, what am I actually afraid of and why? So I think that is the first step. But becoming aware of our fear is a lot different than being consumed by it. In fact, awareness is the only way out of the fog of fear. And we ought to affirm that fear in itself, strictly speaking, fear isn't bad. Fear is an ancient survival mechanism. Our ancestors needed to be on guard, alert to what those lions are up to, just like Jim Fowler. Their fear kept them alive. But there's a difference between being alert and being afraid. So we practice alertness. We become aware. That can take some practice. That can take cultivation. I really appreciate the meditation group that Sandy Roos is leading here, because it's exposing some of our members, maybe for the first time, and reminding others of the importance of being present in the moment, being truly alert to what's happening around us and within us on a very, very basic level. The tempo and the feeling of our breath going in and then going out. Sights and sounds we might otherwise just cruise right past without a whole lot of thought. Faith is found, I believe, in that alertness, because when we can slow down enough to listen to our life, we can see with so much greater clarity. We can see and honestly name what it is we're feeling, including what we're fearing. I'm afraid I'll lose my job. I'm worried about my health. I'm scared of the kind of world my kids and grandkids are inheriting. I'm terrified about what is happening in our country today. Naming our fear brings it out of the shadows and into the light, where we can really deal with it. And deal with it from the posture of calm alertness and the insight of faith. Very often what we're really afraid of is losing control, to be honest. We try so hard to manage outcomes, to shield ourselves and the people we love from risk. And that makes sense. We want safety, we want predictability, but the truth is the world is inherently chaotic in many ways. There's so many things we just cannot control. You might have heard of Ibram X. Kendi. He's the author of a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And he's a brilliant writer, but he's also a longtime vegan, a non-smoker. He's always kept himself very physically fit. But before Ibram ever published a book, he was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer when he was still in his early 30s. By every metric, Ibram did everything right, and yet, thankfully, he's now a cancer survivor. But we know that there are so many things in life, diagnoses, disasters, downturns, that we simply can't prevent or control. That's not fatalism, it's just the truth. And it's that gap between how much control we wish we had and how much we actually have. That's where worry just loves to take up residence. Which brings us back to Philippians, because it's important to see that Paul does not just say, don't worry. He gives us a spiritual practice to follow. He says, by prayer and by supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. In other words, name what it is you're afraid of, speak it, offer it up, have and express gratitude for the ability to be aware of that fear, the ability to name it, and then, and this is the really hard part, it is for me at least, let it go. You do not have to carry it around. Then Paul promises the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Now, that's not a transactional peace. It's not a bargain. Be good and God will give you peace. No, it's not that. It's an invitation to presence, into communion with a spirit that's far more durable than our external circumstances. And just to make sure we don't spiral back into fear, Paul gives us a mental and spiritual discipline to practice. While we're alert to the things that frighten us, we can also visualize letting those things go just to escape our grasp, to pass that baton of fear and stress and worry into the outstretched hand of God, if that's a helpful image. It is for me as an old relay runner. And in doing that, free of that, we can now focus our attention on what is true, on what is honorable, on what is just and pure and pleasing and commendable. Think about these things, these true things. And that is not denial. It is choosing what to dwell on. It's directing the spotlight of our mind away from the monsters and the dark and onto the blessings that are very, very real, even when they're sometimes hard to see. Because when we see the world clearly, when we are truly alert, we discover not just the dangers, but all of the beauty. It's true, the lions are out there. The world is uncertain, but that is not the whole story. We are not forgotten. We're not powerless. The whole story is this: we're never alone. God is always with us, and we have each other. This morning in the New York Times I read Judy Rudorin sharing her experience. She's an editor at the Times. Her experience when her husband, Gary, who's only 62 years old, suffered a stroke early one morning this past summer. He was in the bathroom sink getting ready when he called out to her, and when she got there, one side of his face was drooping. It was terrifying. A moment when anyone feels lost and afraid and alone. Jody and Gary live in suburban New Jersey, and when this happened, the members of her synagogue swung into action to help support both of them and their teenage kids. And she wrote, I know well the value of the meal train, they call it at her synagogue, and it's not just for the recipient. It's a core element of that elusive thing that we all covet, community. She said, if you sign up for this meal train, you cook or buy food, you drop it off, it not only gives you a concrete way of showing that you care, it also makes you feel as if you're a part of something. The word goes out when someone gets sick or loses a parent or a spouse, and soup shows up on their doorstep like magic. And the implied contract, of course, is that when something goes wrong in your life, folks will show up for you. Now, thankfully, Gary's stroke turned out to be relatively minor. Most of his symptoms had faded by late afternoon, but he did require nearly 3 weeks of inpatient rehab to recover his ability to walk, which turned into 3 weeks of very generous people offering to do all kinds of stuff for them. Jody said the food really wasn't what her family needed. It was the many other things, the everyday concerns that she could not handle on her own. And the accumulation of all of that was indeed very frightening. But no problem. Friends and the members of her congregation still stepped up. For instance, a guy named Matt gave Gary his electric razor since Gary didn't want to risk using a blade with his wobbly hand. Their rabbi, who lived near the hospital, let her park in his driveway. A friend named Amy made a playlist she shared, including ironic titles. Remember, Gary was having difficulty walking and rehabbing because of his stroke. So this playlist included songs like Walk This Way, Walking on Sunshine, and Walk Like an Egyptian. Another friend, Raphaelia, took her son to his doctor's appointment. A friend named Jenny texted, "Hey, I'm going to Trader Joe's today," and told Jody to send her a list, which she did, and she said it felt like a miracle because she had completely run out of the coffee ice cream sandwiches she's obsessed with, but definitely did not have time to replenish. We have that very same kind of community that Jody Redorn has. It's the sort of friendships and the mutual support that truly embodies the truth that even when things happen that are genuinely fearful, God is right there through it all, through you and me. And that is joyful. The same spirit of joy that empowered and comforted and brought Paul joy in a Roman prison, the same spirit that breathes through all of creation is breathing in us. Fear may still visit now and then, but it does not have to move in. Worry may knock on our door, but we don't have to answer it. And there is peace, even joy, available to us in every single step. So let us walk forward, walk with each other. And let's rejoice, not because life's always easy, but because God is always good. This Thanksgiving, let's give thanks for all of that, all of the goodness that infuses our lives. Let's be alert to that, not anxious. Let's be aware of that, not afraid. And above all else, let's trust that love, the deepest reality of all, is far stronger than anything we fear. Amen.